Let's jump right in. Today, we're looking back at a day that I think really shook a lot of people.
Yeah, the October 7th attack on Israel, and we've got a lot to work with here to try and understand it. We've got Wikipedia reports from places like Al Jazeera, the Times of Israel. We've even got some first-hand accounts from a frontline documentary to dig into. I'm hoping, especially for those of you who've been following the situation, that we can really shed some light on what happened that day, and, maybe more importantly, why it matters.
I think that's key. It's not just about that one day, it's about, I think, revealing a lot about the bigger picture, the tensions that have been building and the attempts at peace that maybe haven't worked as well as people hoped.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot to unpack here. We're talking about border security, we're talking about intelligence failures, and really the whole context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. So I guess to kind of start setting the stage, what was the situation like in the months leading up to the attack? Like, paint us a picture of the atmosphere, the mood on the ground.
Well, the months leading up to it, things were really tense. There were clashes between Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and there were these attacks from settlers that were increasing. And, then you've got the whole thing with the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. All of that together was creating a really volatile atmosphere.
Right, so it sounds like the region was kind of like a tinderbox just waiting for a spark.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It really was, and it wasn't like there weren't warnings. There were intelligence reports coming in from all sorts of places, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even the Palestinian Authority, all of them. They were pointing to the possibility of a major confrontation, a real explosion if the political situation didn't improve.
I see, so it's not like this attack came out of nowhere. There were signs, there were signals that something like this could happen.
Right, and it wasn't just vague warnings either. They were pretty specific about the risks involved, the potential for a major escalation.
Okay. So then the big question becomes, if there were all these warnings, if everyone was kind of on edge and could see this coming,
yeah,
how did it still manage to catch Israel so off guard? What went wrong? Was it a failure of intelligence? A miscalculation of Hamas's capabilities? Or was there something else at play?
Yeah, it's the question, right. And it's still being debated today. There are a lot of theories out there. What makes it even more interesting is that Israeli officials actually had this document. It's been called the Jericho Wall document, and it basically laid out Hamas's plans in pretty significant detail.
Wait, are you saying they had a blueprint for the attack and still didn't stop it?
Well, yeah, essentially. This document, they got it over a year before the attack, and it included operational plans, locations of targets. It even talked about using drones to disable Israeli surveillance. They even outlined the rocket attacks that would happen before the ground assault.
So I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. They had the intel, they knew what was coming, and yet it still happened. What? What explains that disconnect? Was it that they didn't believe the information, or was there something more to it?
Well, there are a few possible explanations, and to be honest, it's probably a mix of factors. Some analysts say that Israeli intelligence got caught in a kind of cognitive bias, that they'd convinced themselves that Hamas was deterred, that they wouldn't dare try something this bold.
So they kind of clung to this idea even when there was evidence to the contrary, which, in a situation like that, it seems like a pretty dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's even a report from the New York Times where they talk about a member of an Israeli signals intelligence unit back in July of 23. She actually went to her superiors and warned them about what Hamas was preparing. And you know what? They just brushed her aside. They called it imaginary.
Wow. That's chilling, like a textbook example of how warnings can get ignored when they challenge, what people already believe.
Yeah, and it's not like they didn't have the information. They had it, they just failed to analyze it, to really understand it and then act on it. Classic intelligence failure.
Yeah, okay. So we've got the intelligence failures, but then there's the physical breach of the barrier. How did over 1,000 fighters get past the iron wall? Wasn't that supposed to be impenetrable?
Right, that's what makes this so fascinating. This barrier, it cost billions of dollars to build. And it was considered one of the most sophisticated security systems in the world. I mean, it was 20 feet tall, it had underground concrete to stop tunnels. There were all these high-tech surveillance tools, even remote-controlled machine guns, like it was a fortress.
It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. So how in the world did Hamas manage to overcome all of that?
Well, a couple of things. First, the timing was perfect. They attacked at dawn when a lot of people were caught off guard. Then they used drones to take out the surveillance cameras and the weapon systems. And at the same time, they launched this huge barrage of rockets, just overwhelming Israeli defenses and creating chaos everywhere. It was really well coordinated, very strategic.
Okay, but was there anything specific about the iron wall itself, like any weaknesses they were able to exploit?
Oh, definitely. In fact, in that frontline documentary, there's a former IDF surveillance operator, Rotem Horowitz. She talks about how outdated the surveillance balloons were along the barrier. They were unreliable, especially in bad weather, and it turns out several of them were actually out of service on the day of the attack.
So even with all that fancy tech, there were still some pretty basic vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. It shows you that technology alone isn't enough, you know. You need constant vigilance, you need to be able to adapt, and you've got to be willing to admit when you've got weaknesses and fix them.
Right? I mean, what about the towers? The ones with all the sensors and the machine guns, weren't those effective?
Well, the guy who used to run the IDF's fence administration, Danny Teresa, he said the fence was never designed to withstand an attack of that scale and coordination. I mean, it was meant to stop small groups, infiltrators, not an organized military force with that kind of weaponry and tactics.
So they built this fortress, but they didn't fully anticipate the kind of force that would be used against it.
It seems that way. And this is where the intelligence failure really stings, doesn't it? I mean, they had that document, the one laying out Hamas's plans. Why didn't they reinforce the barrier? Why not adjust their defenses based on what they knew was coming?
Yeah, it's hard to fathom how. How could a security breach this massive happen? Yeah, especially when they had all that intelligence. It raises some serious questions about how decisions were being made about the communication within the Israeli security system.
Yeah, it does. The October 7th attack exposed flaws, not just in the physical barriers, but in the whole system, the mindset, you know, the things that we're supposed to protect Israel. It was a real wake-up call. Brutal reminder that even the best defenses can be breached when complacency and this kind of bias seep into the decision-making.
All right, so we've talked about how Hamas managed to get through the iron wall. But what happened next? I mean, what was the immediate aftermath of that breach?
Well, let me tell you, it was chaos. Pure devastation. People scrambling for answers. Imagine, you know, these communities along the Gaza border, they wake up to this nightmare. Hundreds of Hamas fighters, heavily armed, pouring through the barrier, firing rockets, launching grenades. The security forces were just overwhelmed.
Yeah, the sources we've been looking at, they paint a terrifying picture of that day.
It was like the world turned upside down in an instant. The Times of Israel reported that the Sderot police station, it was overrun almost immediately.
Wow.
Yeah, and Hamas, they deliberately destroyed the computers there, cut off communications, you know, delayed the Israeli response.
So this was about more than just getting through the barrier. It was about creating chaos, preventing any kind of organized response.
Exactly. And they pulled it off. I mean, the images and videos from Sderot that day, they're just pure chaos. You see militants driving through the streets in stolen Israeli military vehicles, setting homes on fire, shooting at civilians.
Yeah, and that frontline documentary, I mean, some of the first-hand accounts they got are just, they're chilling. They really capture the terror, the trauma of that day.
Yeah, there's this one guy, Yuri Levine, he talks about the utter devastation and the agonizing search for friends, for loved ones, people who'd been kidnapped, killed, you know, just trying to piece together what happened.
It's hard to even grasp that level of fear and uncertainty.
I know, and the scale of the attack, it was just overwhelming. It wasn't just military, it was psychological. It shattered Israel's sense of security. I mean, those communities along the border, they'll never be the same.
Yeah, all right, well, let's take a moment to let that sink in. And when we come back, we'll dig into the responses to the attack, the repercussions. We'll look at the narratives from both sides and try to tackle some of the really tough questions this whole tragedy raises.
You know, I think when we talk about the aftermath of October 7th, we have to acknowledge just how complicated it is. We're dealing with a conflict that has a long and frankly really painful history. And what happened that day, it added layers of trauma and mistrust that are just incredibly difficult to sort through.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we try to understand how everyone responded and what the long-term consequences are, it's really important to keep in mind that there are multiple perspectives here.
Right?
We can't just accept one side's story as the absolute truth.
That's a crucial point. You know, to start, I think it's helpful to look at how Hamas framed the attack. Their official statements, they really focused on this idea of legitimate resistance. They argued that what they did was a necessary response to, the occupation and the lack of progress towards a peaceful solution.
So from their perspective, this was a justified act of war, right? Against an oppressor.
Exactly, and it's important to understand how that narrative resonates with a lot of Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, they've experienced decades of displacement, restrictions on their movement, economic hardship, all under this occupation.
So while the world, largely condemned the attack, a lot of Palestinians saw it as kind of a desperate act of defiance.
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's interesting, even within Hamas, there were acknowledgements that the attack had unintended consequences. There was this one report they released where they conceded that, maybe some faults happened during the operation and that those faults led to civilian casualties.
Did they elaborate on what those faults were?
They attributed some of the civilian deaths to the rapid collapse of the Israeli security and military system. They said that caused a lot of chaos and that some Israelis were actually killed by their own forces because of that confusion, friendly fire.
So they're acknowledging that things got out of control to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's one way to interpret it, but it's important to note that their main focus was still on justifying the attack as a whole, rather than focusing on specific incidents or mistakes.
Okay. What about Israel's response? We know it was swift and decisive, but what were they trying to achieve initially? And how did those objectives change as the situation developed?
Well, the initial response, it was a mix of shock and fury. I mean, within hours of the attack, Israel declared war. They started mobilizing reservists on a scale that hadn't been seen in decades. And their immediate goals were pretty clear. They wanted to regain control of the border area, and they wanted to get those hostages back that Hamas had taken.
And how did they go about doing that?
Airstrikes. They launched airstrikes on targets throughout Gaza. They said they were hitting Hamas military infrastructure, weapons depots, things like that. And by October 9th, just 2 days after the initial attack, they claimed to have control of the southern region, the area bordering Gaza.
But, that was just the beginning, right? The conflict escalated pretty dramatically after that.
Unfortunately, yes, the fighting just intensified so rapidly. Israel launched a full-scale bombardment of Gaza, and their stated goal was to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, to deter any future attacks. But the impact on civilians, it was devastating.
The sources we've been looking at, they really paint a grim picture of what life was like for the people of Gaza during that time. Thanks for watching the first part of this journey. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss out on part 2. See you in the next video.